All right, we are live. Nice. Hey, Derek, thanks for coming on. I'm obviously Luis here from Gelato, talking with Derek from ZeroDev today. So yeah, Derek, super excited to hear who you are and, what made you start ZeroDev.
Yeah, very excited to be here, Luis. Thanks for inviting me. So just like a brief introduction about myself and ZeroDev, right? So my name is Derek Chiang. I'm the CEO and founder of ZeroDev. I guess let's just start with like when I entered the space, right? So I think I entered around 2018, right? And like I kind of like started my career in blockchain as a L1 engineer, right? So I was helping like a few layer one blockchains, kind of like just like building blockchains themselves. And I guess like before that, I was like really into distributed systems in college, right? So like what attracted me to blockchains in the first place was that I just thought that they were like the most interesting practical distributed systems you can find, right? So like that was the initial reason why I got into blockchains. So after kind of like building in L1 for a few years, I kind of wanted to start my own projects, right? So the first project that I worked on with a friend, and I was the CTO for that previous venture, was when we were building a NFT platform for content creators, right? So it was called Eternal. So we were working with like content creators, like YouTubers, Twitch streamers, esports players, and we were kind of like, if you got, do you remember NBA Top Shots back in 2020?
Yeah, that was big.
Yeah. For sure, yeah. So we were very inspired by that project, right? So we're trying to do the same thing, but with like esports, right? So we actually wound up selling like close to like 1 million NFTs. Made a lot of money for our creators, as like a way to monetize for just like for the content economy, right? But obviously, like the kind of like the as like the NFT market crashed, we decided to sell the project, right? So but that was actually like what led me to work on ZeroDev, because like when I was working on that project, I realized that because like we were trying to sell NFTs to the fans of the content creators, right? And like most of the fans, they were like very new to crypto, right? Like they basically had like no experience with crypto. So I kind of realized that like just like onboarding people to crypto was like a really, really huge issues, right? And back in 2020, 2021, there was just like no good solutions out there. So that was like what got me looking into account abstraction. And that was like really, really lucky timing, because like late 2021 was just when ERC 4337 was kind of like close to being finalized in terms of like the spec, but like the implementation of 4337 was still like very much ongoing, right? So like both me and also my CTO tech kind of like got involved with like the I guess like just like the efforts of like bringing 4337 into production around that time, right? So we both wound up contributing a little bit to the spec as well as like to the implementation of the of the spec, right? So yeah, so that's why kind of like ZeroDev was able to become essentially like the first embedded wallet service that's built natively for account abstraction, like literally at the same day that 4337 was launched, right? So like 4337 was launched in ETH Denver in March this year, and ZeroDev was available immediately, right? And like and I think like we sent like the first user ops on ETH mainnet and like a few other L2s as well. Yeah, so that's kind of like the history of the project, and now we're here, and now we're here today. Yeah.
Wow, really cool. I had no idea that you were working on L1s before. Let me double click on that a bit. Like, what did you do there? When you were working on L1s.
For sure. I think my focus. So the project that I was working. Well, so the first project I was working on was for this company called Definity. Which was like a project that was kind of like in the Silicon Valley. Where I was at the time, right? So that was my first ever blockchain project. So lots of like smart researchers there, right? And I was like spending most of my time working on P2P networks, right? Because like we were trying to essentially find like the faster way for blocks to propagate, right? Because we realized that like other than like the consensus latency, as far as like how much time it takes to just like for the consensus algorithm itself to run, like a large part of the latency as far as like the final like the how much time it takes to finalize a block is actually just like how much time it takes to propagate the block in the first place, right? So we were spending a lot of time just like optimizing like the network topology, like of the blockchain. So that was kind of like my focus there, right? And then after that, I was like hired by this other L1 project, studied by my professor at Cornell. But basically it's like
Algorand
so
or
no. Like it was like another one. There wasn't
okay.
nearly that unfortunately didn't become as successful. But basically so there like I was doing more of a like a developer relationship / BD role. Like I was like the head of developer ecosystem, right? So I was the person who was kind of like deciding just kind of like which application areas to focus on, and like how to work with developers. So I wanted to do that role because I wanted to try something other than like a very deeply technical role, right? So I would say that kind of like what I'm doing today is kind of like a mix of both roles, right? And it's kind of like I'm obviously still very involved with like tech and engineering, but now I also do a lot of like just like actually kind of like figuring out like the right products for developers.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I mean,
Mm.
obviously, I'm also a co-founder of Gelato, and back in the day, 4.5 years ago, when Hilma and I started Gelato, both of us were coding. Like I think the first 1.5 years we were super deep in the tech, and then progressively it became less and less up to the point today where I'm also figuring out like much more than just the tech, right? Like still I'm involved quite a lot with the tech, but I also look at product. I look at a lot of business development, market strategy, marketing, everything. As a founder, you have to, eventually in the early days you can have fun building the tech, but eventually you have to do everything. And as you grow, it's also quite evident that the tech doesn't solve everything by itself. Like building your business network and entering the right markets in the right way is actually super hard and requires a lot of attention. But yeah, so I feel you there. But very interesting. I mean. By the way, did you go to university in China? I know that you're from like Shenzhen, right? Not too far from Hong Kong, the big town there. Did you go to university in China or in the US?
Well, I grew up in China, but I went to college in the US. Yeah, so I went to Cornell, studied computer science. So and I've been spending most of my time in the US since then.
All right, cool, nice. A lot of actually, I mean, at Gelato, I've been working with a lot of people from China who either emigrated or actually who still live there. So cool. And there we have another entrepreneur originally from China, but now based in the US, I guess. Cool. Nice. All right, then. You mentioned that you do a bit of, or like nowadays also a bit of developer relations or whatnot. How would you say 437 helps developers and helps users? I mean, obviously, specifically, how does ZeroDev help developers and users? You mentioned there that in your previous NFT marketplace startup, you learned that user onboarding was one of the main issues, and then ZeroDev was the sort of perfect timing of using a popularized 437 standard as it came on the market and sort of being the first to market there. So first of all, let's unpack how does ZeroDev work today, like ZeroDev itself, how does it work with integration partners and so on to deliver your goal of making onboarding and in general crypto user experience better. And you can really go into some detail here, like the components of ZeroDev, how account abstraction works, how 437 works. Yeah, would be interesting to hear that.
Yeah. So the premise behind ZeroDev was actually very simple, right? Because we were like very involved with the 437 from like even before it launched. Like we knew very early on that it was going to be very difficult for developers to use it because it introduces a lot of like additional, I would say, components into your tech stack, right? So I think at this point, most people watching this video probably have heard of like the terms bundlers and paymasters, right? So like these are like additional infra that you have to deal with as a developer, right? And also like things like the transaction formats of 437 is like different than regular Ethereum transactions. Even like the SDK that you use to just like construct the transactions has to be different, right? So like like regular like Ethers or VM are not going to just work for 437, right? Yeah. So the premise behind ZeroDev was very simple. We basically just wanted to build a kind of like a one-stop end-to-end developer solution that makes it like as simple as possible for developers to leverage account abstraction and ZeroDev, right? Or rather to leverage account abstraction and to leverage AA. So And I would say that like we have mostly achieved that, right? So today when you use ZeroDev, you basically just like sign up as ZeroDev, right? You get an API key, right? And then you kind of like create a wallet object the same way that you would from say Ethers and VM, and you can just like use the wallet object in JavaScript to like send, we call it user ops, but they're really just transactions. And like all the complexities behind bundlers and bundlers and paymasters are abstracted away from you. But like, I guess like zooming in a little bit, right? So I guess you could say that like there are a few different components to ZeroDev, right? So at the most basic layer, we have like what we call a meta infrastructure, right? So so basically what we do is that we work with like all the major AA infra providers in the space, which are like Alchemy, Pinnacle, StackUp, and now recently including Gelato, right? So the way that the infra works is that when we take a transaction from the user, we proxy them and send to one of the bundlers. And the meta bundler is like really helpful because and I'm sure we'll dive deeper into this topic later. But like today, the AA infra is just not nearly as reliable as what people have come to expect from traditional Ethereum infra, right? So it's not uncommon at all for there to be some kind of downtime, right? So the ability for our infrastructure to kind of like just like essentially switch between bundlers if like one bundler is like returning errors has been really critical for our production applications, right? So above like the meta bundler, we have I guess like the most important thing is our SDK, right? So like the SDK, we really optimized it for developer experience, right? It supports both Ethers and VM, meaning that you can pass the wallet objects into Ether and VM, like the contract objects as is, right? And then like, you can just like interact with like the Ethers or VM contract objects, like the exact same way that you would interact with it if the user was using UA, right? So we try to kind of like abstract away the difference between AA wallets and UA wallets as much as possible, so that as a developer, you don't have to think as much about like whether you're dealing with like a UA wallet or AA wallet, right? But like I think at the really at the core of all our technology is a project called Kernel, right? So Kernel was the first modular smart account, and what that means is that it's a smart contract account that's compatible with account abstraction and ERC 427 in particular, but it's also modular in the sense that you can, as a developer, you can actually write plugins to customize and extend its behavior, right? So by default, it functions kind of like a UA in the sense that like the smart account would be essentially controlled by a single private key, right? But like, we have seen many use cases in which kind of like our developers wanted just like more advanced like authentication model, right? So like multi-sig is like a very obvious example. So that's done through a plugin, but also things like, for example, recovery, right? The ability to kind of like set up a guardian for the wallet so that if you lose the initial private key, like the guardian can recover the key for you. That recovery logic is also implemented as a plugin. Another really popular plugin is obviously session keys, right? It's this idea that the smart accounts can create a temporary key with like very specific permissions. So like it can only, for example, interact with like a specific protocol like Uniswap, right? And then like you can give the session key to a third party, and then that third party can essentially automate and send transactions for you, but they only have the permission to interact with like that specific protocol, right? So like that logic is also implemented as a plugin. So I would say to summarize, I would say like the three core parts of ZeroDev is the modular smart account that sits in the middle of everything, and then the SDK, right? That helps you kind of like leverage features like like recovery, session keys, blah blah blah, as well as like making just like sending user ops very simple. And then there's like the meta infrastructure that proxies the traffic to different infra provider in order to ensure high availability. Yeah, so that's like how ZeroDev works in a nutshell.
Cool, nice. So you have the modular smart account, and you have the meta infrastructure. What was the second one again that you mentioned there?
The SDK, yeah. And,
the SDK,
and
yes.
I think actually like one thing I would add to the SDK, very important part of ZeroDev is the fact that we integrate very nicely with like all the popular, I guess you could call them like wallet as a service solutions out there, right? So it's like, Privy, Dynamic, Web3 Auth, Magic, right? So you can use all those popular solutions alongside ZeroDev, so that like those solutions, they can take care of like the UX of like the users logging in. But then like once the users log in, like ZeroDev can take it from there in terms of like spinning up a smart account for the user, right? So that's how our developers get the best of both, like the best of like the UI, right? As far as like what the user sees, as well as like the key features of AA, such as like sponsoring guests for users, automating transactions, batching transactions, and whatnot. Yeah.
Really cool, nice. And we've certainly dabbled with the SDK here. We have combined it with some of Gelato's infrastructure, and it's really great to see this in practice. So, and this kernel that you mentioned is basically part of the modular account system, right? Smart account system. So,
That's right.
So that's okay, cool, nice. All right. So, I mean, we can maybe also quickly just at this point, for some people that listen, I will give a brief history of how I see the account abstraction space and how it has developed. And yeah, so I mean, Gelato has been obviously, in the space since 2019. And we actually, back then in 2019, 2020, you already had the first sort of appearances of gasless transactions. Back then it wasn't called account abstraction so often. I mean, the idea already existed back then, but people were mostly focused on gasless. And it never really took off. Like, I mean, there was one project back then and some others that was pretty big, Gas Station Network, which also happened to be the authors pretty much of ERC 437. But I think one of the issues back then was that the only network that was really active was Ethereum. And even then it was quite expensive to do anything on Ethereum, even though it was cheaper than today. But still, like, this sort of made one of the major use cases for gasless, which was transaction sponsorship, basically not feasible for most developers because it was just too expensive. But yes, and then I think, I mean, Gelato had already, for example, for 2-3 years, even before 437 existed or went live, we already sort of had our Relay API and even our one balance system, which we nowadays call a Paymaster. And as Derek mentioned earlier, we actually, as of recently, made all of our existing infrastructure now also finally comply with the ERC 437 interfaces, which is why you can now use it with ZeroDev. You can now use Gelato's battle-tested bundler and Paymaster, the one balance system with ZeroDev. But yeah, these systems sort of predate 437 even. Basically, the idea, one important thing here is to understand that normally users have externally owned accounts, right? This is your private key that you store in MetaMask, that you set up with like this weird 12-word phrase and so on. And this is normally how transactions get sent to an EVM blockchain by signing, using this key to sign a payload and send it to the network to be included in the blockchain. The problem with that is that these keys aren't very programmable at all. And oftentimes we want to leverage programmability, right? Like we want to use smart contracts to actually do stuff with Ethereum. So why is it that we as a human entity or as a bot, we have these sort of keys that sign stuff, but they can't do much more than that? Why don't we just have smart accounts, right? Like I guess ZeroDev even calls them smart accounts or smart wallets. Why don't we have them? Why don't we use them to store our assets and send transactions? And it's simply like a restriction in the protocol. It's simply not possible to originate. Like you cannot generate a transaction from a smart contract. You always need this external input to trigger anything, any database update on the Ethereum blockchain or any other EVM blockchain for that matter. So yeah, the cool thing about using smart contracts though is that you can do things, abstractions. That's why it's called account abstraction. Like you can say, hey, I put my assets into a smart contract wallet instead of my normal MetaMask wallet. And now I can use infrastructure like ZeroDev and Gelato to, for example, pay the network fee in dollars or not pay at all, right? If an application wants to sponsor for me. And you can do things like batching transactions, right? Like you can say, hey, in one transaction from my smart contract wallet, I want to send some money to a friend, but I also want to do a Uniswap transaction. I want to approve and transfer and whatnot. Like all of these things, programmability work now if you use a smart account instead of your EOA wallet. And yeah, the only thing you still have from your EOA wallet is you sort of sign these so-called meta transactions, right? And yeah, the cool thing about 437 is this is just basically I mean, this stuff also works without 437, like Gelato. Obviously, we've done it before without 437. We've done it with the Safe team, for example, in the past, that in a non-standardized way. And that's the point about 437. 437 is a standardized way of doing this, of doing gasless transactions, of doing account abstraction. Like you can build this yourself at home in the non-437 way and still achieve the same result, but it won't be standardized. And 437 is a standard way of doing this. And I think, I mean, we can talk later about it. Personally, I've always been a bit on the fence because I personally don't agree with some of the implementation details, some of the specification details. I think it is maybe arguably a bit over-engineered sometimes and whatnot. But overall, the one thing that we can all agree on is that it's good to standardize, and 437 simply is the most popular standard right now, and therefore probably also the standard, right? And one thing that's great is that like someone like Derek here, who's building an application that relies on infrastructure providers like Gelato, is not locked into one infrastructure provider like Gelato, right? Like there's others out there providing infra, and the nice thing about the 437 standard is you can now sort of, if they all follow the same interface, which they do, you can now, if one of them goes out of business or if one of them is not like sort of providing a satisfactory service, by virtue of all of them having this 437 interface, you can very quickly change between their systems without much pain. You don't have so much vendor lock-in, right? So that definitely remains, and that's one of the great sort of benefits of following a standard. Whether the standard is perfectly implemented or whether it has some inefficiencies is another question. The nice thing about it is that we have standardization at the interface layer, and now since Gelato, like again, Gelato has like done account abstraction before and was like our one balance system where you can deposit USDC on Polygon and sponsor transactions for your application on any chain. Like this is an amazing paymaster system we've built 2-3 years ago. The one thing we did now is make them come into compliance with the standard, and now 437 wallets like ZeroDev can finally use them as well and have the benefits thereof. Just a quick, or not so quick actually, detour here for listeners who aren't so familiar with account abstraction and the history and what 437 really is. On that note, Derek, I would like to ask you, so account abstraction, or 437 in particular, was long awaited, had a lot of hype around it like a year ago. It came live, as you mentioned, at ETH Denver probably, and so how has the traction been so far? How happy are you with it? What are the sort of biggest problems you still see today? So you mentioned ZeroDev, for example. I already know, like, it can use this as a developer, you can use this SDK. You can integrate with Privy, which is an amazing embedded wallet as a service provider where you can generate, your private keys that you always still need in account abstraction with your smart contract wallet. You can generate them with Google login and whatnot, and so really cool onboarding experience, much better already than what we had a year ago. But yeah, like, what are still some issues, or are you like, or is it just going through the roof? Is there a lot of adoption already? How do you think about that?
Yeah. I think this is one of those classic, I guess you could say, like, you can look at like a glass half full of water, right? And you can say it's like whether it's half full or half empty, right? So it kind of depends on how you look at it. I think the good thing is that so I think one very important point that you just mentioned that I don't think like a lot of people realize is that it's like sometimes like there's like this misconception that 437 is kind of like the beginning. It's like the very first like implementation of account abstraction, right? But really, right, like as 437 is really just like the first like widely adopted standardized version of it, right? Because like even before 437, you can already do most of like what people are doing today with 437, but with like say Safe plus Gelato, right? It's just like that. Like then you would be kind of like buying into and potentially being locked into a particular way of like implementing smart accounts, as well as like a way to relay transactions, right? So 437, I guess in like the most like technical way to see it's just another gas relaying standard, right? It just so happens that it's like kind of like defined in such a way that like it kind of like resolves like the incentives between different players, so that like we see like a very much thriving ecosystem of projects, including ZeroDevs, who are now like building on top of 437. And then like the developers now have like a lot of choice as far as like swapping out their bundlers, swapping out their paymasters, and kind of like not having to worry about being locked in with like any particular vendor, which is huge, right? So as far as like the traction, there's definitely been traction, right? I think and like ZeroDev is like very much part of the traction, right? We currently like our kernel like modular smart account technology actually powers like more than 60% of like all account abstraction wallets, like all 4227 wallets out there, right? So that's pretty huge. But if you look at like the actual on-chain activities and numbers, right? I think it's like safe to say that like the growth of 437 has definitely hit a bottleneck, right? It's certainly by no means exploding, right? It's like by no means on a trajectory to kind of like take over the traffic that's currently being served by UAs, right? And we can dive much deeper into like why, which I assume is kind of like I guess like the meat of the podcast, right? But yeah, so that would be my answer to you, Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I appreciate the candidness here as well. Yeah, I think, I mean, you briefly touched upon it earlier already. Like, I know as Gelato in the beginning of the year, we ran like an experiment in-house because we obviously provide this bundler and paymaster infrastructure. So this sort of lower level infrastructure in this ecosystem of account abstraction wallets. And to understand the pain points of wallet developers like yourself, we did our own thing in the beginning of the year called Gasless Wallet, which was like our own in-house version to experiment with account abstraction. And we realized also so many issues, like you mentioned earlier, you want front-end developers and so on, you want to make their lives as easy as possible when they build an application. And nowadays, when you build an application in crypto, probably you copy a bunch of code that is using Ethers.js, that is using some like VM or whatever library. And most of the code in the last 5 years of Ethereum or longer has been written with sort of MetaMask EOAs in mind. And this is very entrenched in the code. And the problem is, as soon as you introduce smart accounts, you're essentially using a new protocol to submit transactions, right? This protocol consists of first of all, the ERC 437 sort of standard protocol. Then you have ZeroDev's own smart account system. Then you have ZeroDev's sort of meta layer, like their own layer to aggregate different bundlers and paymasters and so on. And then you have bundlers and paymasters like Gelato, who actually take care of the transaction inclusion on chain and also the payment processing. And yeah, all of these things sort of they are very different than the protocol of signing something with your MetaMask and sending it on chain, and this has to be abstracted as well, right? At the end of the day, this difference, yeah, I think the one approach is just to write everything from scratch and sort of hope developers will accept it, but that's rarely how software succeeds, because developers want to minimize their hours spent in a day on trying out something new and changing their code and so on. So the sort of goal here is to endow developers and their users with account abstraction experiences on like Uniswap, on all of these UIs, with as little change from the UX as possible and from the code as possible. And that's very hard because essentially account abstraction is a bit different. Very simple things like, how does the user pay for gas? That dialogue, right? Maybe that doesn't even exist anymore. How are these things sent? They are not sent, like the user doesn't sign the transaction and send it anymore with their RPC from MetaMask. Actually, the user has to sign it somewhere and it's dispatched to some APIs off-chain from where it eventually lands on-chain. So how does this dialogue look and differ from what users and developers are used to from MetaMask? And many other things, like how do you actually leverage the benefits of account abstraction? Like how do you batch stuff, right? Like many UIs are built in this very step-by-step process where a user has to click and sign all the time, which is the horrible UX that we actually want to get rid of. But the paradox is, while you're getting rid of this, you are asking developers to sort of endure a lot of pain because they have to change everything. They can now build their UIs in a way where they can batch things and so on. So there's a lot of these components, and this is essentially what ZeroDev is really focusing on. And I'm very happy there's teams like you out there trying to solve this, because I know it's not an easy thing to solve. It requires a lot of coding. It requires a lot of developer evangelization. But yeah, on this topic, what are the big pain points for you? How do you see this adoption? Like, what are the hurdles to adoption, and what's your plan for breaking this bottleneck at some point? Like, do you think developers have to completely, familiarize themselves with ZeroDev SDK and start over again, or is there like a way that is has less resistance to actually getting them, you know, to build their next version of Uniswap, their next version of synthetics and so on in an account abstracted manner?
Yeah, you know, I wouldn't pretend that I know all the answers, right? We're still definitely like very much like iterating on ZeroDev, you know, as we learn from developers about just like what's so hard about adopting AA, right? But I'm actually currently writing a blog post, and you know, which may or may not be published before this video comes out. But basically, it's like we kind of like identify like the four biggest problems of AA today that are really stopping just like more developers from using AA, right? So to us, like the four biggest problems are, the number one is just like the higher gas cost, you know, which a lot of people know about, right? You know, so with account abstraction, obviously you have to deploy the smart contract wallet, right? So there's like some initial gas cost you have to pay. And what's worse is that you have to pay that once per chain that you want to run on, right? So, but even besides that, like there's always going to be some additional overheads for like every transaction afterwards. Now, there are actually techniques that you can do, you know, that you can where you can kind of like minimize the overheads, such as like BLS aggregation, right? So those are like some of the things that we are like exploring internally, you know, as far as like, you know, kind of like just bringing the lower gas cost to users. But as of like what's available today, the reality is that like using AA means that either you, the projects, or your users are paying more gas, right? You know, than if like your users were using UAs. So what? The second big one is, you know, which is actually the one that you were alluding to, is incompatibility with existing dApps and tooling, right? So as much as like we try to abstract away, I guess like the difference between interacting with a UA or a wallets, it's like there's always kind of like the flip side of abstraction is that like sometimes things, they just like behave in like really surprising ways that you didn't really expect, right? You know, so like for example, I think you alluded to the fact that, oh, like if you are using like a MetaMask as like a signer for AA wallets, then the thing that you are signing is like this like really like intelligible, just like opaque string that like your users don't really understand, right? You know, because like MetaMask doesn't natively understand the concept of AA, right? So it's just like displaying this like random like user op hash for the user to sign. But even besides that, right? You know, so I think even like the more important issue here is like a lot of the dApps are built with the assumption that they are going to be used with UAs, right? So this manifests both at the dApp layer, as far as like the JavaScript, you know, that actually runs the dApp, as well as like the smart contract layer, right? So it's like we've run into projects who like literally on the front ends will check whether like the sender is a UA or whether the sender is a UA or not, and then kind of like behave differently depending on that, right? Because it's like assuming that, oh, if like a smart contract wallet, then it's probably or rather like if the sender was a smart contract, then it's like probably not a legit user, and they will actually like block the transactions, right? So like we're seeing like that front ends do that, and then like on the smart contract side, it's even worse, right? You know, because it's like you know, I'm sure you know that's like in to validate kind of like signatures from the user's wallets, like the way you do it for smart contract wallets has to be different, right? Like you have to like use this standards called ERC 1271, right? Which is adopted by many dApps, but certainly not all dApps, right? So like there are like very popular dApps that break when you try to interact with it or using a smart contract wallets. So, you know, the incompatibility with dApps is like a really huge like adoption hurdle for developers today. And then the third one is the multi-chain experience, right? You know, so I can talk all day about this, you know, but like the TLDR is basically just like when you have a UA, multi-chain is like relatively simple, right? It's like you have a private key, you kind of like compute the same address on every chain, and then like you can kind of just like send transactions on every chain, right? You know, it's not that hard, right? But like with a smart contract wallets, like you actually have to have like a separate instance of smart contract wallets on every chain, right? And Wire is possible to ensure that the address of the smart contract wallets on each chain could be the same, right? Through some you know, smart contract techniques, techniques. It gets a lot more difficult when you take into account the fact that the internal state of your smart contract wallets can change, right? So it's like when you change for example, like the signer or the guardian for your smart contract wallets, to propagate that change across chains, even to chains that you haven't even deployed the smart contract wallet on, that's like a really, really difficult technical issue, right? So that's also like another issue that we have like spent a lot of time investigating internally, and that we hope that we will have like a good solution for pretty soon. But again, as of today, there's another huge additional complexity that any developers building some kind of multi-chain application have to think about, right? And then the last one, the last big problem that I already mentioned was just the fact that AA infra today is not as reliable as you'd hope, right? So that's so those are like the 4 big problems: the high gas cost, the incompatibility with dApps, multi-chain experience, and unreliable infra. Yeah.
That's a great summary, really great summary. And definitely, I think all of these points I also realized. I've never sort of written them down as these 4 concrete points, but this is definitely also what I thought about a lot. Actually, one thing here about the gas cost, right? So interestingly, interestingly at Gelato, we also realized that this is usually actually the underlying issue with user experience in crypto. Often you cannot abstract away or you cannot solve, because ultimately it all boils down to gas being too expensive, right? And the thing is that this is also what we realized, because we've been, Gelato started as smart contract automation, we were the first ones doing that, but very quickly as sort of the second thing. And then, since then we have done serverless, and now as of this year also rollup as a service, as of the summer, which I can go into also in a moment here. But sort of relaying gasless account abstraction, whatever you want to call it, we did pretty early on, like 2-3 years ago. And as I mentioned earlier already, like gas station network even, which was, we also thought about doing a similar thing in 2019. And Gelato actually ended up, like Gelato sort of by coincidence had some similar properties to that. And there we were already trying to solve gas sponsoring and so on, right? Like, so you were able to sponsor gas for users for 2 or 3 years already with Gelato. And some projects certainly used it. There were some successes, but like you mentioned, there wasn't this trajectory of explosive growth ever. And I think ultimately the main bottleneck here is just the underlying infrastructure cost, because the cheapest way to send something on chain will always be like with an EOA, unless the Ethereum protocol changes substantially. So using a smart account will always be, even in an optimized way, will always be. That's actually not true. Like if you start batching stuff and so on, then at some point you actually can be cheaper with a smart contract wallet, of course. But like normally speaking, smart contract wallets and account abstraction protocols introduce some gas cost. And I think the problem here isn't that they do that. The problem is that gas overall on these networks is still just way too expensive, right? Like if these blockchain networks were a lot cheaper and these rollups were a lot cheaper, then at some point it wouldn't matter so much if account abstraction is a bit more expensive or not, if the user operation is a bit more expensive or not. It would be so cheap that the difference isn't noticeable. And the problem is that we're so far away from that today, that even small differences in gas consumption are so noticeable. And that's like the problem here is, as a builder, this frustrated me so much at some point, because I realized the only way to have good crypto user experience, arguably, is if you pay for your users' gas. But this is not really possible because that's too expensive, right? So that's also why we at Gelato started Rollup as a service, because we saw this new technology coming on the market, right? OP Stack, Polygon, ZK EVM, or Arbitrum Orbit, ZK Sync, Hyperchains. So all of these stacks, they're coming on this market and they're leveraging new technology afforded by Ethereum's rollup-centric roadmap, but also by new data availability layers like Celestia, Polygon Avail, EigenDA, where through a combination of sort of modular blockchain pieces, you can build blockchains that are very similar in sort of the trust properties, the security properties that you want to Ethereum. Now, obviously, they aren't as secure as Ethereum or as decentralized and whatnot, but they're good enough for you to build your applications on there and to have extremely cheap gas. Like with Gelato Rollup as a service, in some combinations that we already offer today, like OP and Celestia, for example, or Polygon, CDK Validiums and Celestia or Avail, gas is so much cheaper that you don't even have to worry about it anymore. Like as a developer on the chain, you can definitely pay for all of that gas for you users. And it won't be different to like a normal bill that you would have on Versal or AWS or whatever, right? Like it won't look that different in terms of the total cost for your application. So that's sort of why we started Gelato Rollup as a service. And it seems like to me this is really like the silver bullet for your first problem there. As long as users can move to applications and app chains and networks where gas is so much cheaper than today, then would you worry still a lot about the sort of gas overhead, which is a real problem on Ethereum, Polygon, and BNB and so on today with adoption, I guess, right? Like, or do you agree that this is like ultimately, if gas is just 1,000x cheaper, then this is not really an issue anymore, and people will not use account abstraction anymore because it's more expensive or something? That won't be the factor anymore, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think like that's why we're so excited about partnering with you guys, right? That like, I feel like it's only through working very closely with a rollup as a service provider such as Gelato that we can really experiment with like using AA in a context where like the price of gas can be taken out of the equation because it's just so low that that it doesn't really matter, right? Yeah. So I totally agree with like that trend, of just like people moving to lower and lower gas environments. I think at the same time, I also definitely expect just like very significant volume, whether it's like in terms of trading or usage, to still remain on like the really high or like relatively high gas cost environments, right? Such as like the regular L2s like Arbitrum, Optimism, or even L1s, right? So I also wouldn't say that we are like, we don't have to worry about gas at all as ZeroDev because we only want to serve apps like L3s, right? We still want to make sure that like ZeroDev and AA works well, even on those like high gas cost environments. So that's why kind of like internally we are also experimenting with just like other techniques to save gas, such as, for example, like you said, right? Like just some kind of aggregation, right? To make sure that like the cost is like spread out across many user ops, and also just like optimizing the smart contract wallet itself, right? So for example, kernel, we actually made like a smart contract wallet benchmark that's kind of like used by all the projects today. But basically, like kernel currently is like the lowest, just like the cheapest like wallet to use as far as like the gas cost, right? So I think those efforts are still worthwhile because I think a lot of volume will still be on the like the regular L2s and L1s. But at the same time, yes, like definitely like very very excited to kind of like also deploy and try AA on these like new almost like gas-free environments.
Yeah, and totally like personally, like this might be a bit of a hot take as well, but personally I believe that at some point most of the volumes and especially mainstream whenever they come, right, and we can all agree that they won't come to Ethereum and pay these transaction fees or whatnot, right? Like the whole point of the rollup-centric roadmap is to go away from that. But I think personally, I think that most of the volumes will eventually, hopefully, be on app chains and many different rollups sort of dispersed. But definitely this, I mean, first of all, you have to believe that. I personally believe that, but also this will definitely take a lot of time still. So currently you have to meet the market where it's at, and most people are still transacting on Ethereum and Polygon and BNB and whatnot. So definitely too early to just move to all rollup chains that Gelato has and hope that all users will be there. This will definitely take some time. But yeah, so I think then if the gas problem, like out of the four you mentioned, right? Gas, incompatibility, multi-chain, and what was the third one? The fourth one?
Just the fact that AA infra is not as reliable today as one I hope.
Yeah, it seems to me that like gas, there's solutions, right? We can do further optimizations. We can go to cheaper networks, which seems to be like a silver bullet, right? And as long as the users are actually also there, if you believe that. And then the multi-chain aspect, like you mentioned, I assume you sort of want to have, actually this is one thing people often don't realize as much, but I think one of the killer features of the EOA wallet is that it's external to the protocol and therefore it's interoperable, right? Like as long as EVMs use the same signature curve, like ECDSA curve, whatever it is on Ethereum, then your wallet, as you will have noticed when you used MetaMask on different chains, you can just click add BNB, add Polygon chain, and suddenly you can start sending transactions there with your same account, even with your same wallet address, right? This is really cool about EOAs. Like, this is super interoperable, but you don't have this with smart contract wallets. And actually, I assume that you try to replicate this interoperability level of EOAs for smart contract wallets as well. Like, do you even go as far as trying to give them the same address on most networks? And so on, or what does it mean for you to sort of have one user have one wallet, but that wallet might be on many different chains using many different apps, and the user maybe doesn't even realize this? Like, what does this mean?
Yeah, I think just this whole idea of like multi-chain smart contract wallets probably deserves its own podcast, right? Because it's like a really broad and deep topic. But I think I do want to kind of like clarify one thing, which is like it may not be entirely accurate to say that kind of like just like smart contract wallets are just like inherently harder to get right in a multi-chain context than EOAs, because if you don't do any cool stuff with smart contract wallets, meaning that like if the only thing to do with smart contract wallets is to deploy it with like create tool, right, like the opcodes, with like the initial owner/signer of the wallets, then the problems that I talked about earlier wasn't actually a problem, right? So like you can still get like the same smart contract address on like all the EVM compatible chains, right? And then you can just still use like the same key to send transactions for all these smart contract wallets, right? And like, even for the chains that that are not EVM compatible, you will get a different address. But that's the same thing with EOS too, right? That like with like the same key, you will get different address on Solana than say Ethereum, right? So my point being that like if you just want to use smart contract wallets in like the simplest possible way, it's not that hard. The difficulties really arise when you try to kind of like leverage the fact that smart contract wallets can have state, right? And like the state is like what makes the smart contract wallet interesting, right? So it's like so things like guardians, even like switching like the initial signer, right? Like if you want to do like key rotation, or if you want to like set up like a multi-sig, like that's when kind of like thinking this state becomes difficult, right? So I guess like the point that I'm trying to make is that like if you are just trying to have like almost like feature equivalents of EOAs as far as like being able to sign transactions for smart contract wallets with a single key, then it's actually no more difficult to manage your smart contract wallets, in like a multi-chain way than using EOA. It's only when you try to do more than what you can get with an EOA, then they start running into all these issues, right? But to kind of like answer your initial questions about kind of like how we're thinking about it, right? So basically, again, like really hard to kind of like just like talk in depth about this, without taking up too much time. But basically, so like Vitalik actually wrote extensively about this topic in his recent blog post. So basically the general idea is that essentially like you kind of have to essentially pick a chain as like the source of truth, right? So it's like if you think about how to synchronize state, you have to pick a source of truth, right? Otherwise the problem gets way too difficult, right? So you pick a chain as the source of truth that holds the state for your wallets, and you try to figure out some kind of communication protocol such that when you deploy or use your smart contract wallet on another chain, it will check the state on the source chain and then like synchronize it automatically, right? So that's kind of like the design that's likely kind of like all multi-chain smart contract wallet projects will converge on. But today, that's actually not practical for many different reasons. But TLDR is just that like the cross-chain technology today is just like not fast or cheap enough for this to be really practical, right? But I think the space is definitely moving in a direction in which kind of like cross-chain communication is getting more and like cheaper and cheaper and more reliable, right? And I think like that's when like a truly practical multi-chain smart contract like solution will become a thing.
Yeah, cool. And maybe just to quickly summarize like this, the issue at hand with the state management across chain is one of the, like you mentioned, I think it's more an issue of the additional features over EUAs that we want to add where it becomes an issue. Things like, let's say you have your account and you want to change one of your owner keys because I don't know, maybe you revealed it to someone and you don't trust that person anymore, right? Like maybe you got compromised or whatnot. If your smart contract wallet is then on many chains, it's not enough to send one transaction to change the owner key. You now have to talk to every chain where your old key is still in your account, and then you have to sort of delete it from every chain that your account is on. And yeah, that can certainly cross-chain state management here is a big issue. So I feel this is like, okay, so we talked about gas, we talked about this cross-chain state management. I feel like all of these things they are issues, but they will be solved eventually by technology. Then similarly with the reliability of bundlers and paymasters. I mean, I think one of the cool things about Gelato is that we've had our infrastructure battle tested for much longer than some of the newer 437 projects have, simply because they started, much later than we did. Our infrastructure has been battle tested before 437, even now for 2-3 years on the Relay API, which is our bundler API and Paymaster and so on. So there, I think we have definitely over time, we've fixed a lot of bugs. We are now normally operating at 99.9% sort of uptime, and I think this is something that can be solved. So I feel like probably the hardest issue to overcome will be this, actually, getting the devs, like this non-compatibility with the existing way of doing things. I feel like this is, while in the short term, maybe gas and so on are still one of the major hurdles to adoption. I think this is ultimately going to be hard, but maybe as we solve or we improve the gas problem, the cross-chain problem, and also the speed and reliability of the infrastructure, maybe that is also then sort of reinforcing some developers to also consider it more strongly to change to an account abstraction SDK. All right, so that's that part. Yeah.
I think I'll just add that like the dev incompatibility problem is actually another reason why this collaboration with Gelato is interesting, right? Because the easiest way to solve dev incompatibility is if we are just running on a app specific chain, right? Because it's like if there's only like one app on their roll up, then like we can make sure that like that app is compatible with with smart contract wallets. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So I think in general, I see more and more applications using Gelato Rollup as a service to deploy their application as a separate chain. There's many benefits for this. I mean, I will have a whole other podcast about this as well. But like some of the key benefits are usually it's much cheaper than for your users and for yourself. Like you can actually sponsor gas, right? Like and this is actually affordable. And you can tweak your chain to be much faster. You don't share the network anymore with some other applications that you have nothing to do with, so you're less prone to having congestion or whatnot on your chain, that especially congestion that isn't even originating from your own application, which is even more sort of frustrating when that happens. And yeah, so there's many sort of advantages, and indeed I think one of these advantages also is in general you take a more holistic approach to designing your application, and you can sort of make account abstraction a sort of built-in feature from the start, because you're sort of going back to the drawing board a bit. Although we try as well with Rollup as a service to keep compatibility with the previous systems as much as possible, so developers don't have a hard time. But definitely they are like in a different mindset. They're not just copy pasting. They are saying, hey, I want to launch on my own chain. So usually they have a different mindset. They want to tweak things a bit and make things better than before. They don't just want to, they want to be differentiated to their competitors and so on. And having account abstraction there from day one is certainly something I observed among developers today already that want to launch their own chain. Like most of them say, hey, can we have account abstraction built in like from day one here? Yeah, so that's definitely true. I also see we see this user base as maybe the first user base that will really bring like this massive growth in account abstraction style transactions by sort of building the applications in this way. Cool. One other topic we discussed briefly, or that you touched on, I mean, EOAs themselves, right? Like they also, the way you commission them and so on has also become much cooler in the last year. We've seen projects like Magic and Privy and so on and Web3 Auth really shine. And in general, they improve the process of generating your private key. by having it generated with social login, with Google and whatnot. And this is actually very well combined in the ZeroDev SDK I saw, where you work with Privy, where you can now have this amazing login as a user. You log in with Google, you sort of Privy generates your embedded wallet, your private key, and then automatically this works well with your deployed smart account from ZeroDev, and you have built an amazing SDK together with Privy, where it's really like, for a front-end developer, very easy to build something very cool here. We've certainly tried it. I don't think we have time for a demo today, otherwise I would have demoed it, but you can think of it as you just sign in as a user, you automatically get your private key and your smart account without even really seeing or knowing this, right? Like only as much as you need to know, really, and then you can start clicking buttons, and it's just clicking buttons and sending transactions. But yeah, so first of all, how do you think about this wallet as a service space and your interaction with it? And yeah, I recently noticed that you were quite excited about some new ERP there that is also interesting for private keys, actually, about passkeys. So I would be interested to chat with you about that.
For sure, yeah, no, I think this really I think like the reason why this is interesting is because it lowers the friction for the user as far as like how they think about their keys, right? So like the value props of like projects like Privy or Dynamic or Magic is like they can essentially turn a user's social credentials into a private key, right? But naturally that involves some kind of like centralized infrastructure, right? So I think it's definitely a acceptably good solution for like many types of applications. But I think that like there's always there's also I would say, trend, towards kind of like more permissionless solutions, as far as like kind of like a solution that works even without any intermediaries, right? So I think that's I think you were alluding to just like passkeys, right? Because like there has been like a big narratives about whether we can use like the signing devices that we already have, right? Whether it's like iPhone or like the latest like say a MacBook, they all support like native signing versus like the web authn standards, aka passkeys, right? So it's like in theory we should be able to just like use those keys to sign transactions. In practice, passkeys, they use like a different signing algorithm than what Ethereum like normally accepts, right? So that's why kind of like to date there has not been a practical implementation of essentially just like using the device you already have, such as iPhones, to sign transactions, because like the cost of like verifying a I would say like natively supported algorithms is just like too high on Ethereum right now, right? So that's actually like another reason why I'm really excited for our collaboration, because it's like on a custom rollout, that's when we can really experiment with like different just like signing algorithms, right? So for example, there's a EIP about essentially implementing a precompiler that can verify that validates the signatures from passkeys, right? So that's like not like accepted by just like the wider Ethereum community right now, because it's like a lot of work to require like every Ethereum clients to support such a precompiler. But for a rollup as a service such as Gelato, it makes perfect sense, right? That we can just like implement a precompiler, and then like through ZeroDev, then like users can now spin up account abstraction wallets using nothing more than the signing devices that they already have, such as their iPhone, right? So that's going to be like a revolutionary UI breakthrough. So that's why I'm super excited about it.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. And again, for you listeners, just don't make the mistake to believe that in account abstraction we don't need private keys anymore. Every account abstraction wallet, every ZeroDev smart wallet works with a private key somewhere from the user, usually to sort of normally sign and authorize account abstracted transactions from going on chain. So there's usually this is what we call meta transactions, right? Like the user, instead of sending the transaction themselves, they sign this. Normally you notice this with MetaMask like pop-ups and so on, but part of the user experience that we also want to bring is signless experiences where you just log in or you have session keys and you use just click buttons. But ultimately, the developer is still trying to authorize you as the user, and yeah. So this is where Privy and so on have built cool tools to sort of generate your private keys in a simple manner. And here, what Derek just referred to, this EIP 7212 precompile for like the special signature curve that is not supported by Ethereum and EVM chains, would allow you to, even without a Google or so, generate your private key for sending transactions on chain on your iPhone. You might have noticed this on some applications like DocuSign and so on, where you can now sort of sign in with passkeys. This is like, I noticed this a lot in the last year. Essentially, this is super permissionless, super decentralized. You can use your iPhone to generate your keys and store them, and you can now use your account abstraction wallet just with your iPhone. And the only missing piece here is sort of implementing this in a smart contract, which is very, very gas, sort of costs a lot of gas to actually run this signature validation. But yeah, that's what Derek and I are super excited about. And I guess we can also wrap up here and sort of announce that, ZeroDev and Gelato, we are partnering up, not just in the SDK, where you can now use Gelato's bundler and One Balance Paymaster in the existing ZeroDev SDK, but we're also partnering up for our rollup as a service, where we want to make sort of ZeroDev like a default of account abstraction on there. And that allows us to experiment with these new amazing things like passkeys that simply aren't possible on other public networks, but that we can make possible by either making the rollup super cheap with Gelato rollup as a service, or by actually, maybe merging this EIP into one of the Gelato rollups and having the precompile ready there. So super excited about this, Derek. It was great chatting with you today. Thanks for letting us know how account abstraction works and what the pain points are and whatnot. And even more exciting to be working with you in the future on rollup as a service, account abstraction, and maybe this passkey EIP as well.
Yeah, for sure. Really happy to be here. I think like this next year is going to be like a huge year for Web3 UX. Right? I think like a lot of like the key UX technologies, whether it's like account abstraction, rollup as a service, and whatnot, they're all coming into fruition kind of like around the same time. Yeah. So I expect Web3 to look very different a year from now than right now, right? And I think that like projects like ZeroDev and Gelato will be kind of hopefully like the major forces, to make that happen. Yeah.
Absolutely. Nice. A pleasure working with you, Derek. And yeah, let's give the listeners some more announcements later this year or in January, and maybe we can hop on another podcast in 3 months or so and have the first sort of cool new experiments live. All right. Thanks.